Oh, yeah. I want to begin with a Scottish word that feels particularly appropriate here. And if you pardon the expression, gobshite. Not a terrible person, not a villain, just someone who has managed through a combination of confidence and insufficient reflection to say something that suddenly reveals itself to have been rather less clever than it first appeared. Jaime, you gobshite. That was my first thought. The whole thing began with a restack, a tiny interaction on Substack. Sentences, replies, the sort of exchange that in most people's lives disappears into the endless sediment of the internet within about 24 hours. Except my nervous system doesn't really work like that. Little things rarely remain little. They become weather. Jen McCrae had written a thoughtful piece about the word and. I enjoyed it. I really did. It reminded me of an old essay of my own, The Dangerous Word, and written from a very different direction, but circling the same remarkable little conjunction. I restacked her piece with a slightly mischievous comment about enjoying reading analytic processors explaining in great detail something that gestalt processors seem to naturally do. Then she replied, very gently, very generously. She explained that she was a UDHD. She understood herself to be a gestalt language processor. That learning about GLP had transformed the way she understood her own life. She wondered how I had concluded that she was an analytic processor. And somewhere inside me came that quiet recognition. Jaime, you gobshite. Because she was right. Not that my observation about the essay had been entirely misplaced. I still genuinely enjoyed the walk she took toward her conclusion. But because I had quietly allowed myself to infer too much from the finished page. I had mistaken prose for cognition. And the moment I recognized that, something much larger began moving. That is how these things usually happen for me. The presenting incident is rarely the real subject. The real subject has often been quietly metabolizing itself for months or years beneath conscious awareness, waiting for one apparently insignificant event to provide enough pressure that the entire field suddenly reorganizes. The embarrassment lasted perhaps 30 seconds. The gestalts have been arriving ever since. Often think people imagine writing begins when the fingers touch the keypad. For me, it begins much earlier. Sometimes with a sentence overheard in a supermarket, sometimes with a student question, sometimes with a smell, sometimes with an old song played too loudly on the freeway, sometimes with a tiny interaction online that, for reasons I cannot explain at the time, refuses to leave. This was one of those. Because once I had realized my mistake, another question immediately appeared behind it. If I cannot reliably infer someone's cognitive organization from their writing, then why had I thought I could? And then another. If two adult GLPs can write so differently, what happened between childhood and adulthood? And then another. What exactly have we been studying? And the more I sat with those questions, the more they refused to stay inside that one conversation. They reached backwards into my own writing, into the 11 books I've published, into decades of academic prose, into peer review, into publisher house styles, into my years as a teacher, into the manuscripts that had changed shape to fit institutional expectations, into the pieces I write here on Substack, where I have gradually allowed myself to sound more like the way my mind actually arrives. It's the old question of masking. Not masking the face, masking the route by which knowing happens. And then, unexpectedly, they reached somewhere else entirely, to Marge's Facebook group. Many of you know the group I mean. Thousands of parents of young gestalt language processors asking questions, supporting one another, trying to make sense of children whose development does not seem to follow the expected maps. One question returns over and over again. When will my child write at grade level? It's such an understandable question. Parents are worried, schools are worried. The world measures writing relentlessly. But suddenly I realised that almost everything we discuss about GLP writing concerns children. Can they write a sentence? Can they write a paragraph? Can they organise a story? Can they meet grade level expectations? All important questions, of course. Necessary. But they're not the only questions. Because eventually those children become adults. Some become teachers, therapists, engineers, poets, academics, newsletter writers. Some publish books. Some never stop writing. Some stop entirely. And almost nobody seems to ask what happened in between. How did the wee gestalt processor become this particular adult writer? Why does one sound like an academic journal, another like a poet, another like a therapist, another like a journalist, another like someone speaking quietly beside you over coffee, another like me? And it suddenly struck me that we have almost no language for adult GLP writing. Not because adult GLPs are absent, because we have mostly stopped looking. So this tiny moment of embarrassment became an invitation. Over the next several days, one piece became two became four became 10. Not planned, not outlined, accumulated. Each essay seemed to arrive carrying the next one inside it. The first asked whether writing style could really function as evidence for cognition. Jaime, you jolly gobshite. The second wondered whether a finished essay tells us more about the genre than it does about the thought. The third tried to describe what it feels like when the whole arrives before the sentence. The fourth wandered into hyperlexia. Not because I was a hyperlexic child, I certainly wasn't, but because so many late identified autistic adults describe growing up inside libraries. And I began wondering how those immense textual archives might shape adult writing. Then came genre, the costumes we learn, the publisher's voice, the institutional voice, the professional voice, the curious experience of trying to carry yourself intact through someone else's house style. Then the market, algorithms, publishing, credibility, even my own textbooks, where lesson plans were quietly disappeared because one comment made somebody anxious, only for teachers to begin asking me privately whether I happened to have the lesson plans after all. Of course I did. Then masking, and not social masking, epistemic masking. The hiding of how knowing itself happens. Then translation. How much of the original gestalt survives the journey into readable prose? How much disappears? How much must disappear if another human being is to receive anything at all? Then back to Jen. Because I wanted to say properly this time that I had really enjoyed her essay, that my original appreciation had been genuine, that the mistake was not reading her work. The mistake was assuming that the route through the work necessarily revealed the architecture beneath it, and finally, the research question itself. Perhaps we've been asking the wrong question all along, not does this writing look gestalt, but how did this writer come to know? How did the draft become the final page? What forms did the knowing pass through before we received it? I suspect there are many more pieces still to come. Jaime, you could say. Because I don't think this new series is really about writing, not only. It's about evidence, it's about methodology, it's about what we think when you think we look at another human being's finished work and perhaps quietly. It's also about kindness, the willingness to let someone else's correction become the beginning of your next piece of thinking rather than the end of the conversation. I owe Jen thanks for that. And I suspect she has no idea what she started, perhaps. That's always the way. The smallest doors, the largest rooms. And there's one more thing I should probably say before we begin the series itself. Some people sometimes ask me why I write so much. And the truthful answer is not. I don't really. I don't of us producing are, for want of a better phrase, digital delayed echolalia. These are places where I leave things for myself. Because I know recursion is coming. I know that 6 months from now, 2 years from now, 4 years from now, another conversation, another student, another reader, another publisher, another tiny moment on the internet that will suddenly illuminate one of these old gestalts from a quarter turn I can't yet see. So I leave them here. Little cairns across the path, not because I've finished thinking, because I know I haven't. My writing becomes part of my memory, part of my orientation, part of the archive my future self can return to when the weather changes again. The fact that other people read them still astonishes me. The fact that some of you find them useful feels like one of the great unexpected kindnesses of my life. So thank you, truly. Thank you for walking these strange paths with me. Thank you for letting small embarrassments become large conversations. Thank you for allowing a shy middle-aged school teacher to leave little bundles of delayed knowing around the internet and somehow finding your own recognitions inside them. I think that's all this new series really is. One tiny mistake, one quiet correction, 10 essays. 10 essays that apparently have been waiting for someone to open the smallest possible door. Thank you.